At the Rio de Janeiro Convention Center in November of 1994, 740 seats filled the auditorium in the early evening, the air already warm and thick beneath the rigged-up lighting. The event was billed as a private martial arts symposium, an invitation-only gathering of fighters and instructors who had traveled from 4 continents to watch a single afternoon of structured demonstrations. The year was significant. The UFC had held its first event only 3 months prior. Mixed martial arts existed mostly in rumors and underground footage. This convention, held in the city where the Gracie family had cemented their dynasty, was to be a controlled affair. A showcase of lineage and technique. Nobody in that auditorium knew they were about to witness a humbling that would ripple through fighting circles for 30 years. Royce Gracie was 29 years old that day, 6'1", 217 pounds. He had recently begun accepting challenge matches across Brazil. His record against submission specialists was untested because there were almost no other submission specialists. The Gracie family had held a near monopoly on grappling excellence in the Southern Hemisphere for 40 years. Royce's confidence was not unfounded. He had submitted far larger men. He had ended fights at will. He carried the weight of his family's legacy like a second nervous system. He also carried a private wound that few knew about. Chuck Norris had been invited to this same convention, and the American had declined. The organizers had wanted a title bout between ideologies, striking versus grappling, East versus West, the Texas legend against the Brazilian dynasty. Royce had prepared for months. Then a scheduling conflict canceled the match. The wound festered. Royce, having trained without an opponent, having prepared his arguments and techniques against a phantom, had his dignity redirected into a statement. A public one. The crowd that gathered at the center's secondary stage was smaller than the main event floor. Maybe 200 of the 740 attendees. Brazilian coaches and fighters who understood grappling at the highest level, a few American imports who had come to study with the Gracie family during their boot camp visits, a tournament director named Carlos, who had refereed 3 generations of Gracie matches, a sports journalist from São Paulo, a stunt coordinator visiting from Los Angeles who had worked on action films and had an amateur interest in fighting systems. Witnesses, they stood or sat arranged in a loose gallery around the mat. Then, Royce took the microphone. The speech lasted 6 minutes. He spoke Portuguese, but the gist traveled quickly through translation. He said that traditional martial arts had become theater. He said that karate was beautiful and useless against a man who understood position and leverage. He said that wrestling had created myths of toughness that would not survive contact with real grappling. Then he said Chuck Norris by name. He said Chuck Norris was a fine fighter by the standards of point fighting and sparring, but that against a man trained in Brazilian jiu-jitsu and submission wrestling, Chuck Norris would be helpless within seconds. He said the American had probably heard this and had chosen not to attend for exactly this reason. He said he regretted it. He said he wanted to prove it publicly if the opportunity ever arose. The tournament director Carlos set down his clipboard. The journalist stopped taking notes, pen still against the page. What happened next lasted 4 minutes and 18 seconds in front of 200 trained observers. It felt, in the narration, like 4 minutes and 18 seconds of another order entirely. A different kind of 4 minutes and 18 seconds, the kind that alters how men speak about their own limitations. Chuck Norris stood from a folding chair in the back row of the spectators. He did not rise quickly. He did not rise with drama. He rose as if he had been listening to a lecture that had now concluded and required his physical presence for a rebuttal. He wore a white button-down shirt and navy slacks and shoes of no particular distinction. He was 64 years old. His hair was gray. His body held the density of a man who had trained for 6 decades and had made peace with aging rather than warring against it. He did not stretch. He did not bounce. He did not roll his shoulders. He walked down the 3 concrete steps from the spectator platform to the mat surface, a distance of about 40 feet, with the gait of a man crossing a living room. Royce turned. The microphone was still in his hand. Chuck stopped at the edge of the mat. He did not request permission. He did not have the conversation that protocol suggested was necessary. He simply stepped onto the canvas and looked at Royce and said 2 words. "Let us find out." What followed was a demonstration in distance. It was a lesson in what happens when a man who has spent 6 decades learning how to control space meets a man who has learned how to control position. These are not the same thing. A position is a configuration of bodies. A distance is the space between bodies, the geography between intention and consequence. Chuck Norris had been teaching distance control to Special Forces instructors and Hollywood stunt coordinators for 20 years. He understood distance not as a concept but as a grammar. Second one. Royce moved forward with the commitment of a man who had never met resistance. His hands rose. He did not throw a punch yet. He was establishing range, as grapplers learn to do, closing the gap so that leverage becomes more valuable than speed. Chuck did not move backward. He adjusted his distance by approximately 7 inches, a lateral shift no larger than a single step. This adjustment, small in appearance, changed the geometry of the space entirely. It placed Royce's lead foot exactly where it could not be planted with weight. It made Royce's center of gravity drift forward by perhaps 2 inches, invisible to everyone but the man standing on the mat. The tournament director Carlos's hands had gone flat against his thighs. Second 2, Royce, feeling the distance error, recovered his footwork and closed again, this time more aggressively. His arms moved. Still not a punch but now a grab for the wrist or the collar. Chuck moved again, this time a sideways angle that created what grapplers call a dead zone. A space where neither striking nor grappling could be initiated without telegraphing the entire motion. Royce's hands closed on empty air. The stunt coordinator from Los Angeles had stopped breathing. He had worked with enough martial artists to recognize that the tiny adjustments appearing on the surface, steps of 4 inches, weight shifts of millimeters, corresponded to technical mastery at a level he had never seen in film. Second 3, Royce committed. He reset his stance and threw what submission grapplers sometimes call the opening, a wide low grab aimed at the ankle or the calf. The initiation of a takedown that would place Chuck on his back where jiu-jitsu logic absolutely dominates. This was his best technique. This was the attack that had ended dozens of matches. The motion was fast. The commitment was total. Chuck controlled the distance one final time. He moved not backward but forward and at an angle, placing himself in what fighters call the gate. The space where a takedown cannot be completed because the person being grabbed is no longer aligned with the momentum of the grab. He also did something that few viewers expected. He did not strike. He did not counterattack. Instead, he extended his hand and with one hand, held Royce's shoulder while the Brazilian finished his forward motion and fell past him. Momentum driving him to the floor exactly 7 feet beyond the point where he had initiated his technique. Royce caught himself on his hands. His knees hit the canvas a moment after. The crowd did not cheer. Silence is what follows that kind of clarity. In this moment it is important to understand what distance means in a fight. A fight is not 2 men hitting each other. A fight is a negotiation about distance. The negotiation begins before the first contact. It begins with the positioning of the feet, the angle of the shoulders, the depth of the breath. A man with 60 years of distance control can make a man with 30 years of grappling excellence spend all his ammunition on attacks that land in empty space. The empty space is not luck. It is architecture. Royce stood. He did not dust himself off. He did not look away. What happened next was the moment the story required. It was the moment that separates a lesson delivered in words from a lesson learned in the body. Chuck raised his hand, not in celebration, but in a gesture toward Royce. An extended hand, an offering. Royce walked toward him across the canvas and took that hand and was pulled to his feet. In that moment of contact, Chuck said something that nobody else heard. Not the tournament director, not the journalist, not even the stunt coordinator, who was watching carefully enough to read the mouth movements and still could not parse the words. It was a private sentence. A sentence between 2 men who had just been honest with each other at the highest level. Royce's face changed. The hardness that competition had built into his expression softened into something more complicated. Respect mixed with humility mixed with something else. Perhaps the recognition of a limit being shown to him kindly rather than cruelly. Then Royce stepped back. He was at a fork in the road, the kind that confrontation creates. He could make an excuse. He could say the mat was unfamiliar. He could say he had not trained for this configuration. He could have dismissed the demonstration as a showboating display of footwork irrelevant to actual fighting. Many men would have. Instead, he did something rarer. He turned to Carlos and to the other witnesses, and he said that what had happened deserved examination. He said that grappling and striking and distance control were not separate languages but dialects of the same conversation. He said he wanted to know what that conversation sounded like. The story spread from that auditorium in exactly the way that oral history spreads. It moved through dojos in Rio and São Paulo. It crossed to American gyms where early UFC fighters trained in secret. It traveled through military bases and film sets, but as it moved, it changed. The versions multiplied. In one telling, Chuck threw Royce across the room and through a wall. In another, he did it without touching him, using some technique lost to Western martial arts. Some said he did it with one hand, some said he did it while blindfolded. The core of the story remained intact. An older American had shown a younger Brazilian that distance was worth more than strength, but the mutability of it, the way it gained and shed details as it traveled, was itself significant. The truth of the encounter had become so powerful that it no longer needed factual precision. What the witnesses remembered was this: the silence when Royce stood, the way Chuck did not celebrate, the way the private sentence changed Royce's expression. The handshake that followed, which lasted longer than handshakes usually do. The recognition in Royce's eyes that he had learned something about his own limitations, not as a failure of technique but as a boundary of knowledge. He had trained to be the best grappler in a room of grapplers. He had not trained to be the best distance controller in a room of distance controllers. The specificity of skill once learned is difficult to forget. Years later, Royce would train with American kickboxers and wrestlers. He would go on to revolutionize grappling's place in mixed martial arts. He would build an empire on the foundation of understanding that no single system was complete, that the spaces between styles were as important as the styles themselves. The humbling at the convention center had been painful in the moment. In retrospect, it became architectural. It became a cornerstone. What could have been a wound became an education. Chuck Norris never made the documentary footage available. He did not cash in on the encounter. He did not speak about it publicly. The story lived in the memory of the 200 people who stood in the Rio Convention Center that evening, and it spread from there through the network of fighters and trainers who respect the kinds of lessons that cannot be faked or filmed or reconstructed for entertainment. The story became what stories become, a thing that separates the people who were there from the people who were not. Here is what matters. Here is what remains true across all the versions. A man who had built his life on motion and reaction met a man who had built his life on patience and distance. The man of motion came to the man of patience because his pride required it. The man of patience did not refuse. He accepted the confrontation because honesty requires it. And he handled it with enough care that the other man could walk away injured in his assumptions but intact in his dignity. That is the story. That is the lesson. Humility and verifiable skill are two different things. If you want to know how Chuck Norris taught this lesson to 6 other masters across 3 decades, make sure you are subscribed and comment below. If you want to find out what happened when a Navy SEAL instructor made the same mistake that Royce made, when he assumed that lineage was the same as superiority, stay with us. Next week we will talk about how Chuck Norris dismantled a pride fighter's entire career without landing a punch.